Last August 26th, a ceasefire was reached between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. That's the most recent of a long series of ceasefires. So far, the terms of the ceasefire were familiar from earlier ones. I'll review the record briefly. And the aftermath so far has also fit the usual pattern. And the pattern is very clear and definite, almost exceptionless for the major ceasefires. Israel ignores the terms completely and maintains its repression, its siege, its violence, its criminal activities in the occupied territories, and they are criminal. Hamas observes the ceasefire, as Israel officially concedes, until some escalation of Israeli violence elicits a Hamas response, which serves as a pretext for another episode of what Israel calls elegantly mowing the lawn, another assault of typically greater violence than the one that preceded. The American press and commentary then goes into its regular mode, deploring what the New York Times a couple of days ago called Hamas's assault on Israel, and explaining that Israel has a right to self-defense, asking how we would react if we were being attacked by rockets from Canada, maybe saying that Israel went a little too far in its self-defense activities, but it's fundamentally the victim and justified. And then we move into the next phase of the same pattern over and over again. This began, the first relevant ceasefire agreement was in November 2005. I'll read the terms. It was the agreement on movement and access. It called for, this is a pretty close paraphrase, it called for a crossing between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah for the export of goods and the transit of people, continuous operation of crossings between Israel and Gaza for the import, export of goods and the transit of people, reduction of obstacles to movement within the West Bank, bus and truck convoys between the West Bank and Gaza, the building of a seaport in Gaza, and the reopening of the airport in Gaza, which had been destroyed by Israeli attacks. That's essentially the terms of the repeated ceasefires, including this one, slight differences. The timing of the first of these, November 2005, is significant. That was the moment of Israel's, what they call their disengagement from Gaza. What happened is that Israel decided to remove several thousand settlers from their subsidized homes illegally in Gaza, where they were protected, where they're taking maybe a third or more of the limited resources of Gaza, protected by a substantial part of the Israeli army. And the Israeli hawks realized that this is pretty ridiculous. Gaza was already almost devastated by Israeli attacks. It made more sense to move them from Gaza to subsidized homes in the West Bank, the Golan Heights, which Israel intends to keep. This was presented as a noble gesture, opening the way to peace, but the awful Palestinians didn't take the opportunity and instead decided all they want to do is kill Jews. So they started sending rockets and building tunnels and so on. That's a standard picture. The reality is entirely different. The goal, the official goal of the so-called disengagement was actually described, frankly, by the Israeli official who was in charge of negotiating it with the United States and implementing it. Dov Weissglass, a close associate of then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, he said the goal of the disengagement, I'm quoting him, is the freezing of the peace process so as to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state and to ensure that diplomacy has been removed indefinitely from the agenda. As I said, for the Hawks, it was a rational objective. The propaganda was different. For those of you who are old enough to remember might recall the way the Boston Globe depicted it, big front page picture of a little boy pleading with the soldiers not to tear down his home, with a big headline saying "Never again," meaning we're never going to allow ourselves to be dispossessed from our land again. It was for the American audience, the main target. It was an effective propaganda agency effort. In Israel, the more sophisticated observers simply ridiculed it. Baruch Kimmerling, Israel's major sociologist, for example, described it as it was, a PR gesture designed to ensure that there would be support for Israel's illegal colonization of the rest of the occupied territories. It would have been very easy to remove the settlers with no ado at all. It would simply have been necessary to announce that on such and such a date, the Israeli army will leave Gaza, and the settlers then would climb into the lorries that are provided to them and would move from their subsidized illegal settlements in Gaza to their subsidized illegal settlements in the West Bank, but there would be no PR success from that. It was particularly comical because it was a repeat of what almost in detail of what was done in 1982 when Israel was compelled to evacuate the Sinai, and they staged the same kind of events. I recall there was a headline in Israel's major newspaper, Haaretz, which said, in Hebrew, National Trauma 1982, just ridiculing the show. This was a repeat. If you had incidentally, the same could be true if Israel is compelled to remove the illegal settlers from the other occupied territories. It's not a very hard operation. It's a different story. Well, what actually happened then is not this noble effort for peace, which the Palestinians refused to accept. What actually happened is described quite accurately by the two leading scholars in Israel who have written the definitive work on the settlers, Idit Zertal and Akiva Eldar. Akiva Eldar is Israel's leading diplomatic correspondent. Zertal's a noted historian. What they say is the ruined territory, Gaza, was not released for even a single day from Israel's military grip or from the price of the occupation that the inhabitants pay every day. After the disengagement, Israel left behind scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed, the Israeli settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might. And that's Israel's two leading scholars, authors of the major work on the occupation. Actually, it has an English translation now. It's called Lords of the Land, worth reading. And Israel is still the occupying power. That's recognized, I think, by the world, as far as I know, by every country, including the United States, apart from Israel, of course, which rejects it. It's the occupying power in every reasonable respect. Well, that was the first, November 2005. That ceasefire lasted a couple of weeks. in January 2006, a few weeks later, Palestinians committed a pretty serious crime and were punished for it and are continuing to be punished for it. There was a free election in Palestine, actually the only free election in the Arab world. It closely monitored, declared to be free and fair, but it came out the wrong way. The United States is strongly in favor of democracy when it comes out the right way. When it comes out the wrong way, we destroy it. Remember that this was right in the middle of passionate orations about democracy promotion and so on. It came out the wrong way. Hamas won the control of the parliament. Now, that's not supposed to be the result of a free election. Israel and the United States instantly reacted by imposing a much harsher siege, by other penalties. European Union, to its shame, trailed along behind the master, as it usually does. And that was the end of the ceasefire. It escalated. Israeli attacks continued by June of that year. About 7,700 Israeli shells, high explosive shells, had attacked Gaza, part of the general attack. And of course, the siege was extended. All the terms of the ceasefire that I mentioned were completely abandoned. I say June because in June the attack escalated much more harshly. And so it continued until the next ceasefire, which was in June 2008. Pretty much the same terms. Israel was to end the siege, allow export and import, essentially the terms I just read before from the November 2005 one. The pattern repeated. Israel immediately announced that it was going to ignore the terms of the ceasefire, maintain the siege, maintain violence, and so on. Hamas observed the ceasefire. Israel officially acknowledges that until November 4th, 2008, the day of the U.S. presidential election, when attention was focused on that event. On that day, Israeli forces invaded Gaza, escalated, and killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That led to Qassam rockets, these kind of primitive rockets. They're called rockets. Israel responded. That went on for a couple of weeks. Lots of deaths, all Palestinian. In late December, Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire on the original terms, in fact, terms even more favorable to Israel. The Israeli cabinet considered it. This was what's called a dovish cabinet under Ehud Olmert. They considered the offer and decided to reject it, and instead launched the next episode of mowing the lawn. That was Operation Cast Lead. That was a murderous and brutal operation. There's very good literature on it. In January, President Obama was interesting at that time. He had been elected on November 4th, but he hadn't yet been inaugurated. And he was asked a number of times to comment on the massacre. The massacres were pretty well reported, with the usual twist. I mean, Israel's under assault. But they were reported. And he was asked if he could comment on it, and he said he couldn't, that the United States has only one president, namely Bush, and therefore he can't comment. He was commenting on everything else, but couldn't comment on this. Actually, he made one comment, the usual one. He said, if my daughters were under attack by rockets, I would do anything possible to stop it. He wasn't referring to the children in Gaza who were being torn to shreds and slaughtered, but to children in the Israeli settlement of Sderot, who are under occasional Qassam rocket attack. The assault was very carefully planned, Cast Lead. Of course, Israel totally controlled it. There's no defense. They terminated the assault a few hours before Obama's inauguration. So therefore, he didn't have to comment on it because it was over. And when he was asked to comment, he said, well, we shouldn't look at the past, we should look forward to the future. That's a standard line of major criminals. Forget the past, it's over, let's look forward to a glorious future. If any of you are planning a career as in the mafia or in the diplomatic service, which is about the same thing, it's a good lesson to remember. So therefore, Obama didn't have to say anything about it at that time. Well, right in the middle of the attack, January 8th, 2009, the UN Security Council passed a unanimous resolution, the U.S. abstaining, called for an immediate ceasefire, and then added the usual terms, pretty much the ones I quoted. They were never observed. It all broke down completely with the next major episode of mowing the lawn. That was November 2012. Just to illustrate what was going on, you take a look at the casualty figures for that year, which are typical. There were 78 Palestinians killed, 1 Israeli. Israel was under assault. Then came a ceasefire with the usual terms, the familiar ones. The aftermath of that was described pretty accurately by a prominent scholar, Nathan Thrall. He's the Middle East specialist for the International Crisis Group. What he says is that Israel recognized right away that Hamas was observing the terms of the ceasefire, and it therefore saw little incentive in doing the same. In other words, it ignored the terms. The military attacks on Gaza increased, along with more stringent restrictions on imports. Exports were blocked, exit permits were blocked. That continued for 18 months until April 2014, when Gaza, Hamas, based in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority, based in the West Bank, made an agreement for a unity government, signed a unity agreement. Israel was infuriated, and they became even angrier when not only the world endorsed it, but even the United States kind of tepidly endorsed it. There had to be a reaction to block that. That's quite important. I should say there's a good reason why Israel, with U.S. backing, has blocked integration of Gaza and the West Bank for 20 years. That's ever since an agreement was signed called the Oslo Agreement, which declared that the West Bank and Gaza are a single territorial entity and cannot be separated. Ever since then, the United States and Israel have been dedicated to separating them. There's a very good reason for that. It's rarely discussed, but if you look at a map and think for a minute, you can see it. If Gaza and the West Bank are separated, any kind of limited autonomy that ever might be granted in the West Bank is essentially imprisoned, has no access to the outside world. Any access would be through Gaza. So if you break the two apart and you keep Gaza kind of totally devastated, under siege, anything that happens in the West Bank is more or less meaningless. It's completely surrounded by Israel on one side and the Jordanian dictatorship's close ally of Israel on the other side, very anti-Palestinian. So there is a good reason to keep them separated. And that's one of the reasons why Israel was extremely angry at the unity agreement, which could be a step towards integrating the two as required by the sacred text of the Oslo Agreement, which the U.S. and Israel were signed with the usual cynicism. Another problem from Israel's point of view was that one of the pretexts for avoiding serious negotiations was that it's impossible to negotiate with the Palestinians because who do you negotiate with? They're not unified. There's two groups. There's Hamas, which unfortunately won the election, and the Palestinian Authority, which we support. Well, once they're unified, that goes. So that's another reason for the fury. In any event, it was pretty clear that Israel had to respond pretty quickly and it did. It launched a major assault on Palestinians in the West Bank, also in Gaza, primarily aimed at Hamas, jailed hundreds of people, killed a lot of people, and so on. Finally, that did elicit a response from Hamas a couple of days after lots of killings in Gaza, and that led to the latest episode of mowing the lawn, protective edge. All the way through, I should say that Israel did have a pretext. You have to have a pretext for everything. The pretext for the assault was the murder of 3 Jewish settlers, teenagers who were murdered in the West Bank quite brutally. Israel claimed that they didn't know whether they were alive or dead, and it turned out to be false. They knew right away that they were dead. But it gave a pretext for several weeks of intensive, pretended efforts to search for them, combined with extensive repression. Israel also, and of course, at once Israel announced, Netanyahu and others, that they knew for certain that this was carried out by Hamas. Actually, it turns out they knew right away that it was probably carried out by a cell in Hebron from the Kawasme clan, which has loose connections with Hamas, but has been a thorn in Hamas's side for years. They don't follow orders. And that was pointed out right away by Shlomi Eldar, Shlomi Drori, one of the leading specialists on Hamas. But the act worked very well for the intended American audience, and it looked as if there was a pretext for the operation. Well, that's up to the present. The pattern is very clear. It's hard to miss. It takes considerable genius, maybe, for the media and commentators to miss it. Don't take my word for it. You can look at the record. It's all available. And this is essentially what it is. So far, in the few weeks since the latest ceasefire, it's been pretty much the same. The siege remains. Israel has very slightly relaxed it. There's a report this morning from a very good Palestinian journalist, Mohammed Omer, personal friend actually, who lives in Gaza, has been reporting from there for years. And he says that Israel has allowed a small shipment of sweet potatoes to leave Gaza. So far, that's about it. They haven't allowed products from Gaza to go to the West Bank, which is the natural market. And they used to have a market in Europe for flowers, vegetables, and so on, but that's barely allowed. There are a few other relaxations. Israel, he points out, no longer prevents import into Gaza of shoelaces, ketchup, and I think candy is the third, which they used to block, so that's now allowed. Otherwise, things work pretty much the same way. There is a possibility, which has been discussed by some reasonable observers inside Israel, that this time Israel might be willing to stop, or at least relent a little in the steady torture of Gaza, which has actually been going on since 1948, but intensively in the period I described. The reasons are several. One reason is that Egypt is now in the hands of a very vicious dictatorship, one of the darkest periods in Egypt's history. And that's very beneficial for Israel. They're very happy about that. For one thing, they like dictatorships in the Arab world. Democracies are dangerous. And this dictatorship happens to be very anti-Palestinian, and particularly opposed to Hamas. So it's a decent ally for Israel. So that means that on all sides, Palestinians are kind of contained. That's one reason. A second reason is that Israel's actions in the West Bank, which go on steadily right through this period. In fact, right after the August 26th ceasefire, Israel announced the biggest land grab in decades in the West Bank, in the Jerusalem area. Anything that goes on in the Jerusalem area. And notice that all of this is in strict violation of international law. There is no question about that. It's repeatedly condemned by the Security Council, including the United States. World Court has ruled that it's all in violation of the Geneva Conventions. That's with the agreement of the U.S. Justice. He didn't vote, he didn't join the majority, he wrote a separate opinion, but he agreed that, yes, all of the settlement is de facto violation of the Geneva Conventions, which block the transfer of population to an occupied territory. And there's no doubt, nobody except Israel refuses to call this occupied territories. So it's all illegal. In Jerusalem, it's multiply illegal because there are separate resolutions going back to 1968, which the U.S. also signed, ordering that Israel should terminate any actions that change the character of Jerusalem, where most of the building and development is going on. Anyway, these illegal activities have now reached a point where the Israeli government might consider that they're just too far gone to reverse, so therefore it's less important to separate Gaza from the West Bank and to torture Gaza. The third reason, which Israel has discussed, is the turmoil that's going on in the Arab world, which is very good from Israel's point of view. They like to see Arabs killing each other. And as they point out, it's created new alliances. So there has been a kind of a tacit alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the main U.S. ally, because that's where all the oil is, going back to the formation of the state of Saudi Arabia, kind of family dictatorship. The alliance has been kind of tacit. Now it's a little bit more overt. And with this new collection of alliances and the focus on the Islamic State and jihadism and so on, Israel may feel that it's in a better position to put an end to the torture of Gaza, or at least relent slightly. That's a possibility. So far, there's no indication of it. As I said, the pattern is being pursued just as it's been for years, including the U.S. description. Well, what about the prospects? If you look at the debate over this in diplomatic circles, commentators, scholars, activists, almost universally, there are two alternatives counterposed. One alternative is the two-state settlement that has been an international consensus for 35, 40 years. We're not allowed to talk here about history, remember. That's irrelevant because it doesn't look good. But if you look at it, the two-state settlement was proposed for the first time in January 1976 in a resolution brought to the Security Council by three major Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. They called for a settlement on the internationally recognized border with guarantees for the right of each state to exist, quoting it, to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. That's January 1976. Israel refused to attend the session. Maybe coincidentally, it bombed Lebanon without any pretext, killing 50 people, but that's just normal. It may have been a response to the United Nations. The United States vetoed the resolution. When the United States vetoes a resolution, and remember the U.S. is the champion of vetoes by far, since the UN sort of fell out of control in the 1960s with decolonization. When the U.S. vetoes a resolution, it's, of course, it's not implemented, but it's also vetoed from history. So you're going to have to look pretty far to find the record of this. It's there. Actually, you can even find it in the New York Times the day it was passed. But it's kind of out of history. You can try and search and see if you can find it. Same thing happened in 1980. That's Carter. The United States vetoed a similar resolution. matters in the international arena shifted to the General Assembly, where there are regular votes, 150 to 2, or U.S., Israel, sometimes Marshall Islands, or something like that. The most recent veto, February 2011, actually did receive a little attention. They're usually ignored. That's Obama's veto, February 2011. The Security Council was voting on a resolution to implement Obama's official policy. He vetoed it. The official, that did raise a few eyebrows. The official U.S. policy, which is words, not meant. The official U.S. policy is that Israel should end its expansion of settlements. That's the big issue that's discussed. Actually, the expansion of settlements is a pretty marginal question. The question is the settlements, not expansion. They're all illegal to start with. But the Security Council did vote on expansion of settlements, and Obama vetoed it. Susan Rice, the UN ambassador, gave an eloquent explanation of why we had to veto our own policy, but you can look at that and figure it out. That one, as I said, did receive a little attention. What's actually been going on is that and meanwhile, the United States provides the military, economic, diplomatic support that is necessary for Israel to carry out all its actions, and also the ideological support by the way the issue is framed. It doesn't sell very well in the rest of the world, but it sells here. Now, the way the issue is framed is, as I described, Israel's the victim, has a right of self-defense, and so on. Of course, there's a particle of truth in that. Israel does have the right of self-defense, but it doesn't follow that it has the right of self-defense by force. There's a qualification to the right of self-defense. You have the right of self-defense by force if you have exhausted peaceful means. When you've rejected peaceful means, you've refused even to try them, you don't have any right of self-defense at all. You don't have a right to shoot a pistol across the border. Now, that's evident. The same would be true if it were imaginable, to take the usual analogy of, say, Canada was sending Qassam rockets at New York or something. We would have a right to respond by force if we had exhausted peaceful means, not if we had rejected peaceful means, not if we'd followed the pattern that I just described. So the right to self-defense is just, doesn't arise. Well, the standard description is either a two-state settlement, which is incidentally supported by essentially the entire world. The Arab states, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, Europe, at least theoretically, Latin America, and so on. Israel rejects it. The United States blocks it. Those are the two rejectionist powers. It's essentially why it doesn't get implemented. That's one alternative. It's very common now to say that Israeli occupation of the West Bank, and nobody talks about it, but the Golan Heights has proceeded far enough so that it can't be reversed. And that leads to the second alternative. The second alternative, which is widely discussed, is that there will be a single state. Israel will simply take over the entire area from the Jordan River to the sea, former Palestine, and there'll be a single state. And many Palestinians support that outcome. They argue that then there can be a civil rights struggle and anti-apartheid struggle modeled on South Africa within this single state. Israelis don't, except for the extreme right, Israelis are opposed to that because it poses a problem which is called the demographic problem. The demographic problem is too many non-Jews in a democratic Jewish state. Democratic Jewish state is kind of an oxymoron, but you can play with that if you like. But if there's too many Arabs, it will really be a problem. So that many, especially liberal Israelis, are kind of opposed to this alternative. And those are the choices that are counterposed. Those are the prospects that are laid out. All of this is wrong. It's missing the obvious. Think about it for a minute. Israel has a much better alternative, and the U.S. backing it as well. The better alternative is simply to continue doing exactly what they're doing. And we know what that is. You can read it, observe it. And what Israel is doing with U.S. support, endless U.S. support, is first of all taking over what's called Jerusalem, which is an invention. It's about 5 times the size of anything that ever was Jerusalem. It takes in all sorts of Arab villages and regions around it. It'll take over Greater Jerusalem, big piece of the West Bank. It'll take over, there are corridors that are being constructed to the east. There's a major corridor east of Jerusalem that goes to incorporate a big town, Ma'ale Adumim, which was built mostly during the Clinton years with the purpose of essentially bisecting the West Bank. You take a look at the map. Its lands reach to Jericho, just about, which essentially bisects the West Bank. There's 2 other corridors in the north cutting through, one to the town of Ariel, another town of Kadumim, a couple of others. Israel takes those over. That kind of cantonizes what's left. If you look at the map, it looks as if there's a substantial area that Israel isn't taking over, but that's mostly uninhabitable desert. They're taking over what they want, what's useful. Israel's taking over the Jordan Valley quietly, step by step. They've now reduced the population, the Arab population there from, it was 300,000 in 1967, now it's maybe 60,000. Usual procedure, the army moves in, announces that there's a military area, all the settlements have to leave. Or maybe there's a green area which is not allowed to be settled. The Palestinians are kicked out. If they're Bedouins, they're just tossed into the desert. After a while, it turns out that a military settlement is being built, Israeli military settlement, and it's replaced by an actual settlement. They sink wells all over and slowly develop it. This is a policy, for those of you who know the history of Zionism, that this has been going on for a century. The policy is what's called dunam, is like a quarter of an acre. The dunam after dunam, sheep after sheep. In other words, do things quietly so that the goyim don't notice it. But gradually you get more and more. And when it gets established, it's accepted. That's how the state was built. That's the policy that's being pursued now. With the support, the crucial support of the United States, you can't claim not to see it. Israel will also take over everything that's on the Israeli side of what's called the separation wall. It's a wall which about 85% of it cuts through Palestinian territory. It was declared illegal by the World Court, it certainly is. It is presented as defense against terrorism. But that doesn't pass the laugh test. It's protection for the settlers who are inside the wall. I mean, if Israel wanted to defend itself against terrorism, it would build a wall on the border. It could make it a mile high, tanks up and back each side, atom bombs, anything it wanted, and there wouldn't be a whisper of protest in the international community. That would be defense. But this has nothing to do with defense. It has to do with taking over arable land, resources, a lot of water resources there, and the nice suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and so on. Taking over the Jordan Valley, incidentally, means about a third of the arable land in the West Bank. And of course, it completes the imprisonment completely. Take a look at the map. It's not just Jordan, but also the West Bank. The Jordan Valley will be under Israeli control, occupation ultimately. That does leave some Palestinian cantons. And in typical neocolonial fashion, Israel wants to establish a few places in the West Bank for the Palestinian elites, the rich Palestinians, the educated Palestinians, so they can have a nice place, kind of like any third world country. They go to the poorest third world country you can imagine. There are people who live in luxury that is unimaginable to us. That's the neocolonial pattern. And that's Ramallah, maybe a new city that's being built, and nice theaters, restaurants, so you live like in London and so on. That's the pattern that's being established. There is absolutely no reason, and those are the areas that Israel intends to integrate into Israel. Well, they have very few Palestinians. Those who are there are being mostly kicked out anyway. So at the end of this process of integrating these areas into Israel, there won't be any demographic problem. In fact, if you look at the numbers, it'll actually increase the ratio of Jews in Greater Israel, because they'll bring in 500,000 settlers and scattered numbers of Arabs. So no demographic problem, no problem with a democratic Jewish state. Palestinians will be left in isolated cantons. They can have some kind of autonomy if they want. Actually, what they can have was described graphically by the first Israeli prime minister to countenance the possibility of a Jewish state. That actually is Benjamin Netanyahu, who was considered the ultra hawk. The Labor Party prime ministers like Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, never considered the possibility of a Palestinian state. They're strongly opposed. And when Netanyahu came in 1996, his ministers were asked, could there be a Palestinian state? And they answered that, yes, we're going to leave something to the Palestinians. They can call it a state if they want, or they can call it fried chicken. That's essentially the goal. So there'll be some fried chicken left to scattered Palestinians in the West Bank, a nice town in Ramallah where they can live like Westerners. Gaza kept under siege, illegally of course, and devastated. There's no reason for Israel to move towards one state. Why should they? They have a much better solution. Now, that's the likely prospect. And as long as the United States supports it, there's every reason to expect this steady, regular process to continue. And that really puts it in our hands. Any significant change in this process is going to have to come from here, and it can come from organized activism of the kind that has changed policy in other cases, sometimes even harder ones. And it can in this case too. If it doesn't, I think these are the very likely prospects. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ethan from Israel. Thank you for speaking to us. So let's play a game. Okay, let's say I'm the negotiator for Israel right now, and I completely support letting go of Gaza, no occupation, no military occupation, returning all the settlements, dismantling them, and bringing everybody to the 67 border. Now, you be the negotiator for the Palestinians, for Hamas, and how can you assure me that no rockets will be fired from Gaza anymore, that the first shipment wouldn't be the one from Iran with Shihab freedom to reach anywhere, and that if we let go of the border between Jordan and the West Bank, how can you assure me that I won't have missiles from Nablus or from Ramallah to Jerusalem? So what is that's the thing that's most important for us, the Israelis, at least the majority of us, that's the security, right? That's the lives of our children, same as Palestinians. So how do you
assure you? Yeah, actually, that's about the least important issue, I think. Let me tell you why. The real problem, and the history demonstrates it very clearly, is how can you ensure that a Palestinian state will not be subject to regular Israeli attack? That's obviously the primary question.
I will answer that.
Yeah.
Everybody came here to listen to you. So
okay, that's the primary.
I would be happy to give you my opinion.
Well, the real question is, and the history makes it completely obvious, how do you protect a Palestinian state from repeated Israeli attack backed by the United States? That's the overwhelmingly important question. As far as your question is concerned, it is a question, but a pretty minor one. And the reason...
So our security is less important than Palestinians?
Well, let me tell you why it's a minor one. Actually, I've already told you. If you look over the record of the ceasefires, every major ceasefire has followed a pattern. Check it and see. Israel rejects it, Hamas observes it, and Israel concedes that officially, until an Israeli escalation elicits a response. That's been the pattern in every single major ceasefire. If you don't believe it, I'll be glad to provide you with the documentation. So one reason is that's been the pattern. So there's every reason to continue it, to continue it.
I'm the Prime Minister right now.
Fine. There's another reason. Israel has such overwhelming power that if there was ever anything like you described, they could wipe out Palestine in 2 minutes. I mean, it's like asking look, if the United States conquered half of Mexico 150 years ago, and in fact, that's why the cities in the Southwest and the West have Spanish names. Suppose somebody had asked at the time, how can we ensure that we'll be safe from an attack from Mexico? I mean, maybe some crazy person asked that. I don't think so, because the answer was obvious. The U.S. was able to conquer Mexico in what President Grant described as the most wicked war in history, because it had overwhelming military force. So we now sit on half of Mexico, and if Mexicans try to flee from the effects of NAFTA, which destroyed Mexican agriculture, we send them back. But we're not, and maybe somebody claims we're threatened by Mexico, but it's pretty extreme. We're not threatened by Mexico. And that's essentially the relation between Israel and Palestine.
We're not threatened by Hamas?
There's a simple way to end Hamas rockets, and Israel knows it. Live up to a ceasefire. Every time Israel has never actually lived up to the ceasefires. It has always violated them from the first minute, as I described. But nevertheless, Hamas maintained the ceasefire until an Israeli escalation.
Don't do anything and they'll keep up the
What?
ceasefire? That's the answer?
Pardon?
Okay.
We can,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We are trying to take as many questions as possible, so if we have time at the end.
One of the main questions is, in any scenario of two-state or one-state, one of the big problems is Palestinians or Muslims' ratings are not very high, or Houthis in prison. So what are the prospects of Palestinian leadership under any kind of scenario where there's reconciliation?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
The question is about in either one state or two state about Palestinian leadership, because Abu Mazen's ratings are not fantastic. So the question is, how would Palestinian leadership operate under either one state or two state?
Well, the question of one state is moot. Israel is not going to accept it. The United States will not accept it. Actually, practically nobody in the world supports it. So it's not going to happen. Israel and the United States have a much better option, the one I described. Continue doing what they're doing. There's no reason, no imaginable reason why they should ever accept taking over a Palestinian population that they don't want. There's sometimes analogies drawn to South Africa, but they're extremely misleading. I mean, in the case of South Africa, 85% of the population was black. South African nationalists needed their black population. That was their workforce. They couldn't get rid of them. They needed them. And in fact, they even sustained them. South Africa, when it set up the Bantustans, provided for to try to develop them. They were trying to gain international recognition for them. Israel doesn't want anything like that. They don't want the Palestinians. They want them to go away. They have no interest in them. So they're not going to take them in. They'll leave them to rot in cantons. So there isn't going to be any one state. We can forget about it. There's no support for it, and no remote possibility it'll be instituted. Actually, it could be a long-term objective. The talk about one state is kind of curious. There's a lot of talk about the one state now in the solidarity groups among the Palestinians and so on. Plenty of people propose it. But there's an important point to recognize, and activists in particular should be attuned to this. There's a big difference between proposal and advocacy. Like you can, if you suppose you're against nuclear weapons, you can propose that nuclear weapons be eliminated. Okay, I just did. That's easy. You can, if you want to advocate it, you've got to show how you go from here to there. What's the path? That's advocacy. That's activism. So you can propose that there be one state and feel good about it, but how do you get there? Well, actually, there is a way, and there's only one way that I know. Actually, just speaking personally, I've been in favor of it for 75 years, but you have to find a way to get there. And the only way I know of is in stages, beginning with the two-state settlement that is the international consensus and could be implemented if the U.S. didn't block it in some form. You know, you can argue about the details, but the basic structure is essentially understood. That could be a first step. The chances are very high, I think, that if we got that far and the cycle of violence was reduced, you would see exactly what has happened in the past every time that the violence reduced. What you see is the beginnings of connections between the two communities, the commercial, cultural, tourism, and so on. I mean, anybody who knows that territory, anybody who's traveled there, knows that there is just no way to draw a line through the former Palestine. Every way is crazy. It's just really crazy. And I think those borders would begin to erode. And as they began to erode, there might be moves towards closer integration, federalism, kind of thing that's happening in much of the world, where borders are eroding, like all of Europe, for example. Closer connections, maybe some form of binational arrangement of a kind that exists in other places. And there's another possibility, more significant, long range, but not impossible. If you take a look at the border between, the border between Israel and Lebanon, for example, it's a completely artificial border. It cuts right through the Galilee. Actually, I had personal experience with that 60 years ago. I was living in a kibbutz in Israel, and my wife and I, we were students. We were just hiking through the Galilee, backpacks, student stuff. And as we were walking, it was the evening, a Jeep drove by on a dirt road behind us, and a guy got out of the Jeep and started yelling to us in Hebrew, telling us to come back. We had crossed into Lebanon. Yeah, and because it's the same place, there's no meaningful border. And I think those borders could erode too. They're all imposed by imperial force, like all over the world. They have no legitimacy, and they're the source of conflicts everywhere. And in time, they might erode, as in fact is happening it's happening in Europe and it's happening in other places. In my view, that's the only possibility, only circumstance in which the question of the rights of refugees can ever be seriously considered. Short of that, there's no advocacy that I know of. But that might lead to a situation in which it could be partially dealt with in an amicable fashion. And I think these are all possibilities. But if anyone can think of a different scenario, I haven't heard it. And until they do, there's no other advocacy of a single state, just talk about it. And I think the talk is very misleading because it diverts attention away from what is happening and what is going to happen unless U.S. policy changes.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I'm Caroline. I'm actually an activist for Open Hillel, which is having a conference at Harvard this weekend that talks about opening up the conversation with Palestine and the Jewish community. But anyway, I want to ask you, what are some tangible steps that activists in the United States can take that you think will change U.S. policy to be more, I guess,
Yeah, that's the crucial question we ought to be asking ourselves. What can we do about it? Now, there are a number of things. First of all, actions should be designed which will change U.S. policy. You can take actions which will punish Israel, and I think there's reason for that. So the European Union has taken a pretty strong step. They have passed directives, whether they'll be implemented, we'll see, but directives blocking any connections with Israeli institutions that have any activities in the occupied territories, which of course Europe regards as illegal activities, like the whole world outside the United States. So if that's implemented, it's pretty strong. And it's being implemented because of popular pressure. Okay, that's a strong action. And there are other actions of that kind. Some of the major churches in the United States, Presbyterian, United Church of Christ, have called for a divestment from any institution in Israel or the United States, notice both, that have any activities in the occupied territories. That's essentially saying, let's stop participating in criminal actions. I think that's a good step to take. But the real significant acts will be directed at U.S. policy, I think. And there are very concrete things that can be done. So take, for example, U.S. shipment of arms to Israel. That's very important. We actually just saw how important it was during the latest Gaza attack, Protective Edge. You've probably read in the papers that in the middle of that attack, which was a very fierce assault, Israel, which is armed to the teeth, began to run out of weapons. They needed replenishment of their weapons. The Pentagon provided Israel with more weapons in a very interesting and revealing way. The weapons came from U.S. weapons which are pre-positioned in Israel. They're pre-positioned in Israel for eventual use by U.S. forces in one of their, peacekeeping missions when they destroy a country in the Middle East. That's part of the reason for the very tight relationship. Israel is considered just like a U.S. military base in the Middle East. Anyway, the Pentagon released weapons to Israel. They didn't even ask the White House, which was a little irritated, and some talk followed. But bear in mind that the weapons that the U.S. provides to Israel are, first of all, in violation of international law, as Amnesty International, others have been pointing out for years, but they're also in violation of U.S. law. U.S. law explicitly bars the sending of weapons to any military organization that is engaged in human rights violations. Israel's involved in human rights violations up to the sky. All of our weapons to Israel are in violation of U.S. law. It's the Lay law, it's called, Patrick Lay. That's a good organizing point. I think it's a very good organizing point. I think Americans can be mobilized to stop sending weapons in violation of U.S. law to a country that is carrying out major human rights violations. And there's a lot of reasons. Part of the reasons is just concern about the economy. Why should we be doing this? I think that's an option that can really be pursued, has been for years. And I think that could affect U.S. policy. And there are other things like it. Another thing to be done is what you can see right here in this room. 10 years ago, literally, if there was a talk on Israel-Palestine at MIT, there would be maybe 20 people showing up, most of them trying to break up the meeting, screaming, yelling. There would be police protection. In fact, the police would insist on walking me back to my car, literally. Israeli human rights activists were shouted down by protesters organized in the Jewish community here. That's gone. Things have changed radically. By now, it's one of the biggest issues on campus. there's overwhelming support for Palestinian rights, a new understanding. That hasn't happened by a miracle. That happened by activism, by organization, by education, outreach. And what happens among the younger population, college-age population, sooner or later affects the general population. It can be done. It's happened in other cases. That's how the anti-war movement got started in other cases. Actually, that was even the case in South Africa. People forget what happened in South Africa, or maybe never knew. The United States was the last country to support apartheid. Even Israel backed down before the United States did. Reagan was a hideous racist. He supported, literally, Reagan refused to believe that there was a race issue in South Africa. His view was it's just a tribal conflict. It's the Zulu, the Bantu, the whites, they can't get together. And he was even trying to override congressional sanctions against South Africa. Finally, it got to the point where the U.S. government had to go along with the rest of the world. There was enormous protest support here, protests in other countries. The U.S. finally did abandon support for apartheid. It collapsed. That's not the only case. It can happen in this case.
Thank you.
So we heard a really detailed description of Israel's incentives and West Bank.
Sorry, I can't hear. Can you hear?
Say okay. So we heard a really detailed description of Israel's economic incentives in the West Bank and why they're trying to colonize that, which makes a lot of sense. And we heard a lot of description of what Israel is doing in Gaza. But I was wondering if you could talk specifically on why Israel would be attacking Gaza when it's not sort of as economically interesting to Israel as the West Bank is in the surrounding Jerusalem area.
So why is Israel continuing to attack Gaza?
Yeah, why would Israel be so interested in harming Gaza when it's not
Well,
interested?
I mean, let's suppose it were to stop. Suppose Israel were to stop attacking Gaza. Gaza is potentially a pretty rich place. It could be a Mediterranean resort, like the Riviera. It has beautiful beaches. It has agricultural resources. It can produce. It has a very natural market in Europe and the West Bank. It could be a reasonably flourishing area. Could have a seaport, which it used to have. Could have an airport, which it had until Israel destroyed it. It could be a kind of a flourishing Mediterranean. Gaza used to be one of the main producers of fish for the region. They don't do it anymore because the Israeli Navy refuses to allow Gaza fishermen to go more than a couple of kilometers offshore. Pretext is security, but that's a joke. When they go only a couple of kilometers offshore, that means they have to fish in waters that are heavily polluted because Israel's destroyed the sewage plants and periodically it destroys the power plants. So the fishing industry has been almost wiped out. But it could be, again, as it was in the past, a source of fish, agriculture, flowers, sweet potatoes, which they're now allowing out, and a very fine resort area. Europeans would come to it, Israelis would come to it. But then remember, if the U.S. and Israel agree to adhere to the Oslo Agreement, there will be a connection between, free access between Gaza and the West Bank, as incidentally explicitly declared in all of these ceasefire agreements. I read it before. Well, that means that the West Bank will have an outlet to the outside world. That means that the West Bank could be a viable, functioning area. Israel wants the West. It wants not the whole West Bank. It doesn't want the population. It wants maybe 50% of the West Bank, the parts that I mentioned. for the same reason that people in Boston want to have the western suburbs. I mean, if you look literally, the nice suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are in the West Bank, in the hills, and there's a huge infrastructure development, all illegal, of course, which enables you to go on a superhighway from wherever your Jewish settlement is in the West Bank to the main Israeli cities without ever seeing an Arab, because they're not allowed on them. And they want to keep all that, just like they want to keep the resources. It's not for security reasons. In fact, that was made very clear a long time ago. So you go back to shortly after the occupation of the West Bank, there was a lot of discussion in Israel at the time of whether to keep it or not. And one of the most prominent figures, Ezer Weizmann, who was the head of the Air Force, big war hero, later was president, kind of a dove in the Israeli spectrum. He pointed out, he said, look, there's no security issue. If Israel were to withdraw from the West Bank, it might even improve Israeli security. But he said, if we do, we will not, if we withdraw, we will not be able to live at the scale and quality that we now enjoy. Okay, yeah, that's true. Like if, say, Boston was to give up Lexington and Lincoln, it could not, there'd be no security issue, but couldn't live at the scale and quality it now enjoys. Faculty like me couldn't live out there, you know. And but those are the issues. If the Gaza was allowed to flourish and join the West Bank, it wouldn't be a rich country. It would be a small country, demilitarized, of course, totally overwhelmed by Israeli force, and but it would still be viable. And that means Israel would give up what it wants to take over in the occupied territories. And so the same is true of the Golan Heights. They're Syrian territory. Israel annexed them in violation of explicit Security Council orders. The U.S. voted with the unanimous Security Council at that point. Israel went ahead anyway. And now, you take a look at the commentary in the press now. Commentary in the press says, well, look, if we gave up the Golan Heights, we would have ISIS on our borders, you know, right in the Galilee. That's not true. If Israel had a security argument for keeping the Golan Heights, they would have no settlers there. The settlers harm security. That was made very clear during the 1973 war, when Syria attacked the Syrian Golan Heights. The Israeli army couldn't respond until it had first removed all the settlers, which wasted a lot of time. The settlers are a burden for security. So if there were any security reason, what they would do is just militarize the Golan Heights. They don't do that. They want it for nice vineyards, a nice place to live, you know, skiing on the mountain, all kinds of things. That's not a security issue. The question is, will Israel accept to become part of the region? You know, not a regional, not a state dominating the region. That's a choice.
Take the last two questions. So, yeah.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. First, I just want to thank Palestine and MIT for hosting this event. It's really amazing. Professor Chomsky, I'm one of the organizers for the National Students for Justice in Palestine Conference, which is going to be held at Tufts here later this month. A lot of people in the Palestinian activism community I feel confused as it pertains to your views on BDS. So I'm wondering if you can just clarify what your views are, what your stances are, so on and so forth.
Yeah. I've written about it if you want to look it up. And actually, I just said a few minutes ago, when BDS activities are perfectly reasonable. In fact, I was personally involved in them before the BDS movement even formed. Sure, it's always makes sense to carry out, to stop participating in criminal actions. That always makes sense. That means to boycott. What it means concretely is to boycott institutions, including U.S. multinationals, incidentally, important part of it, which are involved in criminal activities. There are lots of them. I look out my office window, unfortunately, at the Koch building. Okay, I can make some suggestions about that.
I work there.
But you work there, okay. Well, it has, it's supposed to be the most green building on campus. Is that true? But, which is kind of ironic if it's the case. But there's very good reason to boycott criminal activities. The sanctions don't arise because sanctions are imposed by states. And there's no sanctions. Divestment is a possibility, like divestment from, let's say, energy corporations that are destroying the environment, or from corporations that are carrying out repressive activities or even construction in the West Bank. That makes very good sense. That's why the European Union move was quite important. It was focused on the occupied territories. Now, if you take a look at the BDS movement, I'm not talking about the tactics, which makes sense, but the movement, it's ambiguous. It has a platform. You can read it. And the platform changes from now and then. At the beginning, when it was formed, it had 3 planks. The first was calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions on 3 issues. 1, the occupied territories. The second, civil rights. Actually, the first was civil rights anywhere in Palestine. They later changed it to civil rights in Israel. Third, return of refugees. Okay, the first of those planks makes perfectly good sense. And in fact, if you look at the BDS activities that have been carried out, almost without exception, maybe without exception, they're focused on the occupied territories, including the major ones, which the BDS movement actually had nothing to do with, like the EU movement, the EU directives. That's really important. Focused on the occupied territories. When you talk about boycott and divestment concerned with civil rights in Israel, that gets tricky. There is undoubtedly a significant repression in Israel. I've been writing about it for 50 years. I'll give you details. But if you move that way, you immediately open a question: why aren't we boycotting the United States? There's plenty of. Take, say, the African American population in the United States.
Right. So the response would be that BDS is a call from Palestinian citizens. Okay.
Suppose that the black community here, the African American community, says, let's boycott the United States. Okay? Suppose it's coming from the African American community. Is it a meaningful proposal? It's more like what I call proposing, not advocating.
But, okay, so then the response
First of all, it's not really, there's a question whether it's coming from the Palestinian community, but let's put that aside.
Okay.
Suppose it is. Why should we, if we're opposed to violation of civil rights in Israel, how come we're not opposed to it in the United States?
So as somebody who's an advocate for BDS, I would say if black people in the United States called for BDS, I would not dictate to them how to resist their oppression, and I would have to stand in solidarity with them. So since Palestinians, who are the ones dealing with oppression, and being Palestinian myself, since Palestinians called for BDS, is it really your place or anybody else's place to dictate to Palestinians how they should resist?
Yeah, but you're talking about a point of principle at the level of proposal. I'm talking about advocacy at the level of doing something. If any effort that has been made to start BDS-type activities aimed at civil rights in Israel has failed, and it has failed in a way which leads to a backlash which actually harms Palestinians. You have proposals which, get a petition, maybe 100 people sign it, you get a backlash with 10,000 people signing it. That harms Palestinians. And the reason is very simple. The educational and organizational work has not been done. People here, plausibly, don't understand why we should be opposing violation of civil rights in Israel when we're not opposing comparable or often even worse violation of civil rights right where we live. Until you can convince people of that, and that's not easy, these efforts are going to not only fail, but even cause a backlash, which is harmful to Palestinians.
But you yourself just called it a matter of principle. If it really is a matter of principle, then how could it be excluded?
How can it be excluded? Because one of the real problems that the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian solidarity movements have had for many years is that they try to act on principle instead of practically. I'm not the only person to say this. Raja Shahada, who you may know, just had an article criticizing the Palestinian leadership way back, saying one of the reasons we've always failed is because we like to stand on principle and we don't look at what can be achieved. And meanwhile, the Zionists say, forget about principle, let's go dunam after dunam, we'll see what we can achieve, and therefore they succeed. If the Palestinians want to succeed, they're going to have to face the real world. It's a real world where there's no use stating a principle. You can state a principle, fine, let's eliminate nuclear weapons. Okay, we're done with that topic. You have to have proposals as to how you do something about it. And if you want to do something about civil rights in Israel, which you should, I mean, I've been writing about it and talking about it for 50 years, educate people about it and support the groups in Israel that are doing something about it. So, for example, there are significant steps going on in Israel which are similar to the civil rights movement here. I could talk about it if you like. Okay, that makes sense. But approaching an American audience and saying, let's boycott Israel because they carry out repressive actions against Palestinians in Israel, it has always failed in the past. It is going to continue to fail. Stating it as a principle is no use because you're living in a real world in which people's immediate reaction will be, as it has been, why not do something about it right here, like boycotting the United States. You can't overcome, the only way to overcome that is by carrying out a difficult task, which has not been done, a task of education and organization, which will make it plausible to people that we should oppose these actions in Israel while we don't oppose them here. That's not easy. You take the third point, the refugees. Even more, there has not been a single BDS action aimed at the refugee problem which has even begun to succeed. In fact, every one that's been tried has led to an immediate huge backlash saying you're calling for the destruction of Israel. Well, you can't ignore that fact. You can't live in a dream world. You've got to design tactics for this world, not for some imaginary world. Now, is there a way to deal with the refugee problem? Actually, I know of only one actual form of advocacy, the one that I mentioned. Try to go in stages towards an erosion of the imperial borders, which should not be sacrosanct, and that could lead to an opening where there could be interactions that would deal with part of the refugee problem. Other than that, it's not going to be anything more than symbolic. There is zero support for that in the world. Zero. You cannot say, let's do something where there's zero support for it. That's just, that's making a principle a point of self-destruction. I mean, look around, there's no support for it. In fact, if you look at the legal basis, even that's pretty dubious. The appeal is to Resolution 194, right? The Resolution 194 is not a Security Council resolution. It's a General Assembly resolution. General Assembly resolutions are recommendations. They have no force. There are all sorts of General Assembly resolutions. if this issue ever arose, and it's so remote in in any meaningful sense, if it ever did arise, every smart Israeli lawyer would say, well, first of all, it's a recommendation. Secondly, we're perfectly happy to readmit the refugees. They've all died by now. And the resolution doesn't talk about the grandchildren of refugees. You immediately get into this, it would get nowhere. And there's no basis for it. So calling for BDS actions aimed at the refugee problem, while you can say, okay, it's a principle, but it has no tactical meaning. And I think for activists, it's extremely important to focus on tactics that can achieve something, not a statement of abstract principles. Just as Raja Shahada pointed out, that's been a kind of a lethal blow to Palestinians for years. I should say the Palestinian national movement has been quite unusual in this respect. I mean, over my lifetime, I've been involved with national liberation movements from all over the world. With the exception of the Palestinians, they have all understood that you have to make compromises. I was in Gaza recently, and there was a discussion kind of like this. And some of the young people, nice people, said, why should we make compromises? The national liberation movements don't make compromises. It's exactly the opposite. Every one of them has made compromises. Take, say, the Vietnamese. In 1954, they made a serious compromise. They agreed to temporarily, they thought, relinquish control of half the country. The U.S. intervened, it wasn't temporary. And then you look through the record, they continually made compromises because they were trying to achieve something, not win points in a debate, but achieve something. And the same is true of every successful national liberation movement. The Zionists, for example, they didn't pose the principle, I mean, they have a principle, like the governing party in Israel, Likud, its ideological core is Cherut, Menachem Begin's party. They have a principle. Tell what it is in Hebrew, but it's Israelis here will know it. Both sides of the Jordan, this is ours and that's ours too, meaning Jordan is ours. That's part of the land of Israel. Begin always insisted on that. That's never been revoked. It's still their principle. But they don't put it forth. They don't say, let's stand on principle. We're not going to talk about anything until Jordan, we take over Jordan. Maybe they have a long-term goal of doing that. But if so, you do it step by step. You try to achieve something now. Okay? And that's incidentally, that was also the principle of the majority of the kibbutz movement. Achdut Avodah, which was the largest part of the kibbutz movement, had the same principle. But they don't, I mean, it's kind of back there in the history, but nobody talks about it, though they've never rescinded it.